So welcome back to Morning Joe. Joining us now, White House correspondent for Bloomberg News, Shannon Pettypiece, editorial director for the Washington Examiner, Hugo Gurdon, professor of history at Tulane University, Walter Isaacson, Mike Barnacle and Eddie Glott are still with us as well. And Walter, President Trump, true to form, has responded on Twitter to Senator Mitt Romney's scathing op-ed that we've been talking about, and I want to get your take. The president tweeted a short time ago, "Here we go with Mitt Romney," but so fast. Question will be, is he a flake? I hope not. Would much prefer that Mitt focus on border security and so many other things where he can be helpful. I won big, and he didn't. He should be happy for all Republicans, a team player and win. Walter, we've seen criticism from the Republican side, Republican senators who are outgoing. Mitt Romney is incoming, and he hasn't even been sworn in. Does this dynamic look different to you? And do you think he creates a space for voiceless, spineless Republicans?
Absolutely. Mitt Romney is everything that Donald Trump isn't. He's deeply moral, a very kind person, somebody with a sense of civic duty and civility. They share some conservative thinking, but that's not the big divide in America. The big divide in America now in our politics is those who want to help unify us, those who believe that we're stronger working together as a country, and who have a certain decency and kindness and empathy for other people. And then there are those, and you see it in Donald Trump's Twitter feed, that are expressed by resentment and really attacking and trying to belittle other people. So it's not just a question of policies, it's a question of tone. And as you said earlier in the show, we're going to see a divide in the Democratic Party, too. And I think that divide of those who will be the unifiers versus those who are really going to become resistors or aggressors, that will be a difference in tone in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, Hugo, I'd love for you to chime in about how Republicans who perhaps haven't used their voices in the past on the issues of civility and decency, maybe this is a new year, especially given the change in dynamic with Democrats in power, at least in Congress.
Yeah, I actually disagree. I think that plenty of Republicans, obviously a couple who have left the Senate, Flake and Corker, have been very critical of the president. I think that what this op-ed by Mitt Romney does is just pick up what, to use his word, the mantle of the intra-party opposition to President Trump. It was obviously a very carefully premeditated attack on the president. It set Mitt Romney up as a leader of the intra-party opposition. It got the response from President Trump that you would expect. And frankly, you know, if you're attacked like that, the president hits back, not actually very hard, it seems to me. So yes, I think that Mitt Romney will enter the Senate and be one of the voices, the principal voices against President Trump. Is that a surprise? Not in the least.
And I just want to ask, who has been critical? You say a lot of Republicans. I said, on one hand.
I said, well, I mentioned Jeff Flake. I mentioned Bob Corker. Yep. You know, the fact that other people have not doesn't mean to say that they're spineless. It means that they don't necessarily agree.
Okay, sure. Shannon Pettypiece, looking ahead then to the meeting today in the Situation Room, which NBC has confirmed that it will be held there. So he's not going to have the cameras out this time. How do the Democrats manage a deal? How do Democrats and Republicans manage a deal and know that the president will actually speak to that very deal that they have cut, if they can cut one, after the meeting?
Right. Like, do they have to get him to sign something in blood in order to know that what he agrees to in the meeting is what he is going to stand by? Because that's their concern. That's what Democrats are voicing their concern is that, Vice President Pence, Mick Mulvaney, Jared Kushner come to the Hill. They promise one thing, and then the Democrats talk amongst themselves about whether or not if they do that, or if they compromise or make some concessions there, the president's actually going to sign something, or are Democrats going to end up making concessions, using a few of their some of their political capital, and then have the president reject it anyway because he's still tweeting about a concrete wall and $5 billion, right, even though other people from the White House are talking about metal slats and around $2 billion range. So, but it's interesting what Democrats have done, because they left the White House hanging over the past 5 days with really no contact. And as of Thursday night, the White House thought they were going to be having negotiations with the Democrats. They thought the Democrats were going to counter the proposal that the vice president gave them. And then Thursday night, the Democrats said, no, we're all going to leave for the holiday. We'll talk to you guys later, and left the White House hanging. And that's a very Trumpian negotiating tactic, to just walk away from the table.
So let me go back to Hugo on the point that he ended on, because the president has now turned his attention from Mitt Romney to his border wall. Right. And he has tweeted again moments ago, Mexico is paying for the wall through the new USMCA trade deal.
Right.
Much of the wall has already been fully renovated or built. We've done a lot of work, $5.6 billion that House has approved, and is very little in comparison to the benefits of national security. Quick payback. So do Republicans think that, we should go for this concrete wall? This is what the people want? Do they believe that? I mean, help me understand the ones that don't speak out.
All right. Look, I think that as far as walls are concerned, we've got ourselves into this extraordinary sort of semantic game. Is a wall still a wall if it isn't concrete and it's steel? Does it turn into a fence if you can see through it? I mean, both sides are trying to win this at a political level. I think the important thing to know about the wall is that it's become somewhat the equivalent of the George H.W. Bush promise, read my lips, no new taxes. It helped him win in '88, and it ensured that he lost in '92. I'm going to build the wall, Trump's phrase from the election, it helped him win. The danger for him is that if he betrays that promise, his base will desert him and he'll lose in 2020. That's what the Democrats want to make sure of, and that's why they're not willing to let him have something which can possibly be called a wall, and it's why he has to have something where he can walk away saying, you see, I got the wall.
Yeah. But is he going to get a big concrete wall all paid for by Mexico? And what do Republicans do when that does not happen? These Republicans who don't say what's really going on.
The paid for by Mexico was always a kind of absurd thing. And I don't know whether even his supporters who wanted the wall took that very seriously. I don't think they mind one way or the other who pays for it. I think that it probably sounded good. What they want is the wall. And will Republicans talk about what is actually built there or renovated, what the border security is? Sure. And it will not be a wall from one coast to the other coast. It's going to be it's going to be partly fence. It's going to be partly wall. It's going to be partly drones. It's going to be all of those things, and the battle will be over the way that it is described.
Yeah, Mike Barnacle?
Walter Isaacson, Hugo just said we have gotten ourselves into this back and forth about the wall. I would submit that Donald Trump, has gotten himself into this back and forth about the wall. But the extraneous elements of the talking about the wall are, in their own way, maybe more damaging to the fabric of this country than the talk about who's going to pay for the wall. By that, I mean, one of the more outrageous tweets that the president had over the past 10 days, where he literally blamed one political party, the Democratic Party, for the deaths of young children along the border. And this further pollutes an already sick element out there where people are tired of the talk, they're tired of the back and forth in Washington. And I'm just wondering, you're down there in New Orleans. Where is the exhaustion factor, do you think, right now, about talk about the wall, the fact that nothing gets done in Washington?
I think that's a perfect word for it, Mike, an exhaustion factor. I think as we go into 2019, and even the last month roller coaster, and certainly the last year roller coaster, people in Louisiana, they're hurting a little bit with no soybean exports and the down in trade. But in particular, they just don't like this every morning getting up and saying, oh my God, what has happened now? So I think the American political system tends to fluctuate between periods of great activism and desires for great calm. I think we're seeing a desire to have everybody grow up a little bit and calm down. When you look at the issue of immigration and the wall, we know there's a pretty simple solution. George W. Bush got close to it, whatever. You could come together and say, look, we need some more border security. We need some relief for DACA, the undocumented children. They need to be able to say, we could get this together, but our country's government right now continues to polarize these things.
Well, you know, there's a sense
Eddie.
in which this discussion around the wall has this nasty undertow, that it's really about Trump exploiting fears. It's really about a deep sense of vulnerability. Shannon, what is the motivation? What would be the incentive for Democrats to actually negotiate with Donald Trump on this issue? Because they understand what he's doing politically with the wall talk altogether. What would be their motivation?
If they start getting a lot of political blowback from the shutdown, that's how these things end. One side gets just battered by their own base. But at this point, Democrats don't seem to be going after Democratic leadership, and Trump's base doesn't seem to be going after him. But once government workers start missing their paychecks, that could change.
Absolutely. Shannon, Pettypiece, thank you very much. Hugo, Gurdon, thank you. And Walter Isaacson, thank you as well. Up next, American Overdose. A new book takes on the country's opioid epidemic, the stigma of addiction, and what the government is doing about it. That important conversation next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.